For this last lecture, we're going to look at Sonnet 130. It's represented up there in the Roman numerals, and it's also referred to as "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun." Sonnets are referred to in Shakespeare's canon by either the number or the first line. And so we're going to read it as we always do, and then we're going to just basically do an overview of what's going on in this sonnet. So I'll read it for you. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why, then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes there is more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music has a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. This is a great sonnet because during the Renaissance it was very common for poets to write officioes. And it's a kind of fancy master's level term that talks about a woman in all of her beauty, starting at her forehead and going all the way down to her toes. And in those poems, the poet would say how beautiful her forehead was, and her eyes, and her cheekbones, and her ears, and her hair, and her lips, and her neck, and her shoulders, and her breasts, and her waist, and her hips, and her thighs, and her knees, and her ankles, and her toes, from top to bottom. He would describe every part of her body and how beautiful she was. And what we see Shakespeare doing here, I call a reverse officio, and that is he is talking about the woman that he loves, and he wants to describe her from head to toe, but he's describing beautiful things, and then he's saying she is not these things. And so that seems a little strange, to write a poem about your mistress, someone you care about, but then write it in this negative way. So let's just pause for a moment. What would that make the subject of this poem feel like if she were going to be the subject of someone's lyric or someone's poem, and then they described all these beautiful things and said, but you're not that? I think the most striking line, although you can decide for yourself, but is that perfumes smell delightful, but my mistress' breath reeks, right? So let's just look at it line by line. The first line is kind of shocking. He introduces his mistress and this intimate connection, but then he immediately says something negative. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. And we know that when people are being compared to the sun, they're being compared to something that is bright and beautiful and hot, and it's usually a good comparison because it's full of power. But in this case, he's saying, my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. In a Renaissance metaphor, in a sonnet, it would be a metaphor would be used to increase the value of the person. But in this case, he is actually decreasing the value. So that's the first thing I think that we would notice if we were studying this. But then he goes through and he lists the things that she is not. He says she is not like red, this color associated with passion. Her lips are not red. Her roses are not damask. That's like variegated, like both red and white. A lot of times people will put makeup on to make their cheekbones sort of stand out and look rosy. And he's saying, but her lips and her cheeks aren't like that. As a matter of fact, they're sort of bland. He goes on to use additional negative ideas. He says that he compares her to something that is snow white, and that snow white, of course, is always representing purity and goodness, but he says that she is dun. Her skin, her breasts are brown or gray, not so pure. Maybe not bad, but human. He compares her hair to wires, not something soft and beautiful like silk. And he gives indication of the color of her hair being dark and wiry. A damasked rose, which I already mentioned what it looks like, it would have been prized for its uniqueness and its beauty. But he says, no, no, her cheeks don't have that uniqueness and that beauty. They're rather uh, dull. And so already we see this massive lack of perfection in his description of her. And I don't know about you, but if I were being described this way, I wouldn't think this was terribly romantic. He does say some nice things like, I love to hear her speak, but then he follows it with something negative, but music is better. I enjoy listening to music more. And then he says, I grant I never saw a goddess go. He says, I've never seen a goddess float through the air. You know, when a beautiful woman comes into a room, she floats. You know, she seems to be above walking and clomping. But he says his mistress, when she walks, no, her feet tread on the ground. She's not a goddess. So in the three quatrains, we know that a problem or an issue is going to be presented. And the problem here seems to be he's telling us about his mistress, but he's describing her saying she's none of these perfect ideas of beauty, right? And so that definitely is a problem if this is a sonnet directed to her. But then he says in the couplet where he resolves it, and yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. And so what he's saying here is, she's not perfect. She's very human. She doesn't fit some romanticized ideal. Yet, I love her more than anything that you would put up with all those false or fake comparisons. And so in that final couplet, he actually makes this a very beautiful tribute to his very human mistress. Again, this is called a reverse fictio. He's actually mocking the process of describing a woman as a perfect creature, because we all have flaws, and he's sort of recognizing that she's rather ordinary, but in all of that ordinariness, she's in a relationship with me, and I love her more than anything. So it turns out to be actually rather beautiful. Sonnet 130.